Everyone talks about wanting change. All these speeches that I've heard, change, 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 but it's time to get specific. We can march every damn day, and we can pull down every statue of every racist that slaughtered and enslaved other humans in order to erect a society that served him and his friends. But if no laws change, and if no consequences are doled out to the bad guys, then change will remain just an illusion. It'll be a traffic delay and some new art. I want real change. I want law enforcement to be accountable to our laws. No more killing with impunity, and that goes for here and overseas.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the 216th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, this is a podcast about Congress. And to produce it, I read bills and laws and read documents and articles and watch way too many hours of hearings to find out what's going on Capitol Hill, because that is our branch of government and most of us don't know what the fuck goes on there. And this is a selfish endeavor, really. I wanted to know what they're doing with my tax money and in my name. And so since 2012, I've been learning and sharing what I find with you. And I do this for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that I've stopped trusting corporate media to tell me the truth, even when it makes their advertisers look bad. And since trust is earned in being the person giving you information, I provide you with all of my sources and give you timestamps for every hearing clip that I play so that you can go and watch it for yourself in context. Trust but verify. And so I make that as easy for you as I can when it comes to our relationship. Now, producers of today's episode are going to help me to present a vision of how police brutality in this country can actually be minimized by the 116th Congress, which is the Congress in power right now. And to present this vision, I'm going to do something that I just said in at maybe the last episode, maybe 2 episodes ago. But I just said that I wasn't going to read bills that are just moving through the House that haven't become law yet. And yet today, that's exactly what I did. For today, I read the Justice in Policing Act, which is what the Democrats in the House of Representatives wrote in response to the protests over George Floyd's killing. Because I don't think any of us believe for 1 second that this would have been written and actually moving in the House if it weren't for hundreds of thousands of Americans hitting the streets. But the way that I see this bill, the Justice in Policing Act, is that it is a list of what's possible with this current group of humans that we have empowered to write laws on the federal level in the United States right now. And so today I'm going to give you the background that you need to understand the most promising provisions in this bill, and then discuss how I think we can force what we want into law this year. Even though I know the limits of my own personal power, how can ideas spread if they are not put out into the world? And so I'm going to spread an idea today, or at least try. And this examination of what's possible in the 116th Congress would not have been possible without the Congressional Dish producers. This podcast operates on the value for value funding model. We produce this show together. I do the physical work and you do the funding. And as long as you hold up your end of that bargain, I'll keep doing the work to make Congressional Dish exist. And I have set up every payment option that you've asked for. They're all listed in every episode's show notes on congressionaldish.com. But real quick, if you want to pay per episode, Patreon. And you get an uncensored version of these episodes on Patreon too, for those of you who hate the golf swings. If you want to pay monthly, you can do that with paper checks or Zelle or PayPal. And then if you want to send in lump sums, you can do that with checks and Zelles and PayPal, and then also Venmo. That is quite popular lately. And when you do start producing the show, you get thanked in the bonus thank you episodes, where I give updates on past topics, let you in on some of the details of my personal life, and we have conversations via your production notes. Those are my favorite episodes to produce. They're very fun for me. But I do want to let you producers know that the podcast's finances, since, this is a voluntary expense and we're still mid-COVID, well, the finances have taken a bit of a dippity-doo lately, and so if you can pay to produce the show, we really need you to right now. And of course, thank you if you already do. Now, before we get into the police brutality bill and everything surrounding that whole rabbit hole, I do have to do I don't know if this is a correction, but I do have to give you a clarification. Because episode 215, which was about the COVID-19 testimony, well, we heard some testimony from Dr. Rick Bright, who was the head of BARDA, which is in charge of like pharmaceuticals in the United States. Well, he was the head of BARDA until President Trump demoted him. And Dr. Bright thinks he was demoted because Trump wanted to flood the tri-state area, which at the time was crippled with COVID, with Trump's beloved hydroxychloroquine. And in telling you that story, I told you about a study that said that hydroxychloroquine increases death in COVID patients. And since that recording, that study has been retracted. So what's the truth about hydroxychloroquine? I have no idea. But the point in that episode was neither did Donald Trump, and he demoted a scientist who wanted the standards to require a doctor's supervision if that particular drug were to be prescribed to someone with COVID-19. And the reason that matters is that safety first guy is no longer in charge of vaccine development in the United States. And that just led to a whole bunch of when it comes to how they are developing the COVID-19 vaccine. Listen to episode 215 if any of that interests you. And so there you go. Study was retracted. Now you know. But that's enough COVID for today. It is spiking again in 19 states, and so I'm sure we'll visit our old virus friend again soon. But since I last spoke to you in this year 2020, when 2 weeks is a lifetime, well, shit hath hitteth the fan here in the United States. The shit was thrown at the fan by the on-camera murder of George Floyd by a cop in Minneapolis. And then the shit was flungeth around the world with example after example after example of police using excessive force against people who dared to stop cars from moving freely in our streets. And yeah, I know there have been riots and looting. Oakland got trashed again. All the windows in our shopping complexes are boarded up again. But I have to be honest with you, I like to tell you my bias up front, but I'm really struggling to conjure up too much sympathy for Target, Mercedes, and J. Crew. I care that George Floyd is dead and is never coming back. I care that I really think that any of my wonderful law-abiding black friends could be next. I care that photographer Linda Tirado, who's a journalist, lost her eyeball when police shot it out with a rubber bullet at a protest. She's never getting her vision back. I care that police are being so reckless with their violence that people who are just there, not even protesting, but just there, are getting critically injured by the cops. I care that those with power are abusing their power and that it's gotten to the point that they are killing us on the streets with impunity. I care about people more than windows, money, and merchandise. And so if I do have a bias here in the way I'm covering this, there it is. Those are my feelings. I'm really over watching abuses of power go unpunished in this country. But at the same time, I do have to tell you that I care about cops. I have friends who are cops, and I have family who have been cops. In fact, I've never been allowed to serve on a criminal jury because I care about cops. My second cousin, or cousin once or twice removed, who knows? But I have a cousin, and he was a Simi Valley police officer. He was called out to check on a teacher, whose family was concerned about him. My cousin knocked on the door, and when there was no answer, he went around the back of the house. The teacher, who was inside the house, saw my cousin and shot him, and then wouldn't let any of the other officers anywhere near him to help him, and he died. Now, I didn't know this particular cousin well. He was an adult, and I was 12 when he died. But my parents were close with his dad, and I remember my parents were so devastated. It was the first time in my life that I ever saw them that sad. And my cousin had an infant son who never knew his dad, and the whole thing was just incredibly fucked up. You know, he did that job to help people. He went to that house to help a stranger. And so I appreciate people who do that job every single day, knowing the dangers. And so because of these feelings, I'm confident that I do have the ability to empathize with both sides of this. But with power comes responsibility, and it's the police that are trusted with power. With issues like this, I feel like the focus should always default to those in power. And so if this episode feels like it's targeting the police, it's because it is. Because they, not the looters, are the ones with the power to use violence, and that power is clearly being abused. George Floyd, used a funky $20 bill at a shop and ended up dead when a cop sat on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It takes 5 minutes to, for sure, suffocate someone to death, which I know because I've been watching a lot of forensic files during COVID. There's 110 seasons of it on Netflix, and it's like watching headline news all day without commercials. We've been learning about how to murder people nonstop. And so what I saw with George Floyd is that was a straight up murder. We all saw the video. And other cops helped. 2 of them held George down, and 1 did crowd control. None of them were afraid of anything. And then there's Breonna Taylor. She didn't do a damn thing wrong. She was an ER tech taking care of COVID actually at the time. And after she got home from one of her shifts in the middle of the night, a gang of stormtroopers busted in her door, and her boyfriend, for good reason, thought they were being attacked or robbed or who fucking knows, it was the middle of the night. And all of a sudden there's a bunch of dudes in your home yelling, and so he shot at the intruders. The intruders were cops, and the cops then sprayed the room with bullets, and now Breonna's dead. And it turns out that the cops were doing a SWAT-type raid for a drug thing that Breonna and her boyfriend had nothing to do with. They thought, the cops did, that drug packages might have been delivered to her home. Nope, it was clothes and shoes. So Breonna and her boyfriend shopped online during COVID and paid for it with their lives. Whoopsie. They were human beings, and both of them should be alive, and everybody knows it. In Minneapolis, it was clear on that video that the officers were not at all concerned that their behavior was being filmed. They looked right at the cameras. The looks on their faces, like they were not at all concerned with getting in trouble, that's the look of impunity. That's what it looks like when people think the rules don't apply to them. And for anyone that wasn't sure after seeing that video, the cops all over the country proved the protesters' point over and over and over again these last 2 weeks. We've seen video after video of cops beating humans with batons and covering streets with chemical gases designed to make us sick and shooting people with rubber bullets. Just doesn't quite explain these things. They're like plus-sized, super heavy, rounded corks that the cops are shooting out of guns at people. They leave massive bruises when they hit you, and they take out people's eyes. The cops fired those randomly into crowds and directly at human faces. And it wasn't just protesters that got shot by on-duty cops. A girl was walking home with her groceries and found herself bleeding after being shot with one of these rifle-fired police brutality butt plugs. When police can act with impunity, all of us are in danger. You can't just safely walk on by. And so, even though I know that racist police are real, and I know that black people are targeted more than white people, my own life is an example. I compared notes on traffic stops with some of my black dude friends in Oakland. Every one of them has been pulled over dozens of times. I, white girl, have been pulled over twice in my whole life. Once was because I really was speeding on PCH in Laguna Beach. I was 16, so that's 1998. That was my only traffic ticket. And then I got pulled over in Bumpkin, New Mexico somewhere. And I don't know why I was pulled over. I actually think I was profiled as a hippie since I was driving a lime green bug. But I cried my way out of that one. And that's it. There's no way that I'm that good of a driver and that all of my black dude friends are that bad. There's no way. And so I know that's a real problem, but I'm not going to focus on race today because this is an all of America problem. Law enforcement, from the president to the cop on your street, all of them need to be brought back into our system of laws. We have law enforcement acting with impunity on every level in this country. And everyone talks about wanting change. All these speeches that I've heard, change, but it's time to get specific. We can march every damn day, and we can pull down every statue of every racist that slaughtered and enslaved other humans in order to erect a society that served him and his friends. But if no laws change, and if no consequences are doled out to the bad guys, then change will remain just an illusion. It'll be a traffic delay and some new art. I want real change. I want law enforcement to be accountable to our laws. No more killing with impunity, and that goes for here and overseas. But here at home, we've turned Sheriff Andy Taylor and Lenny Briscoe and Carl Winslow into warriors. And it's time that we change them back to cops on the beat. And those protests, the sizes of the protests and the all 50 statesness of them, they've given me hope that a majority of us now know this too. And so I do think changing this culture of impunity in the police departments, I do think this is possible. I don't think perfection is possible. Perfection is not possible with this Congress. Not now and maybe not even ever. But specific changes to law that get us one step closer to perfection, yes, I think it can be done. And I think it can be done by the end of this terrible year. And so today I'm going to give you specifics. I'll show you what can be done. I'll show you what is already written and moving through this Congress. And I'm going to tell you what I think is our best play for getting the possible provisions actually into law. I call it the Dingleberry Method. We've seen it used for evil many times, but I think it could be used for good. So the House is out of session this entire month because the Democrats want to allow their selfish, weakling, coward coworkers to keep hiding in their homes instead of getting their asses back to work like the essential workers that they are. But in the meantime, hearings with half attendance and lots of tech issues are still happening in the House. And so the House Judiciary Committee had a hearing on police brutality on Wednesday, June 10th. It was 6 hours long, and George Floyd's brother testified, and the politicians knew people would be watching, and so it was a total pander-palooza. 5 out of the 6 hours were painful to stomach. But during the brief interludes, when the witnesses were asked relevant questions about the Justice in Policing Act, I learned a lot. 2 of the witnesses who testified are people we're already familiar with here on Congressional Dish because they also testified about H.R. 1 earlier in this Congress, which feels like a bad omen based upon what happened to that number 1 priority of the Democrats in the beginning of this Congress. Quick refresher, H.R. 1 was the For the People Act, and it was a package of mostly excellent provisions strengthening our electoral system that I was truly excited about. It had automatic voter registration, mandatory paper ballots. It would have stopped a lot of Republican voter suppression efforts like cross-checks and voter caging. It would have made Election Day a holiday, and it would have made redistricting the job of an independent commission instead of letting the parties pick their voters. And most importantly, it would have limited campaign contributions, also known as bribes. It was a really good bill, and I was naively excited about it. And I'm not overly proud of episode 192. I don't like airing my mental breakdowns on the internet where they live embarrassing me forever. But watching the Democrats prove that H.R. 1 was nothing but a publicity stunt broke my brain. The Democrats, led by Nancy Pelosi, passed H.R. 1 through the House, where they have the majority of the votes, at warp speed, mostly skipping the committee process. And this is important because that's where the case for bills are made. And then they just let it die in the Senate. They blamed Mitch McConnell and then just stopped trying. They could have broken up the bill into pieces, held hearings on each piece, and argued for each good idea one by one, forcing the Republicans to publicly and constantly defend their anti-voter, pro-money in politics positions. But they didn't do that. They just let their number 1 priority die. And so the entire H.R. 1 effort was a fraud. And I'll be honest, while I think a different fate is possible, that's the point of this episode, this is the most likely fate of the Justice in Policing Act. If we move on from police brutality based on the past performance of this exact group of lawmakers, they will move on too. But looking out at the streets right now, it seems like people give a shit about police brutality. At least at this moment, this feels different. And so maybe this time will be different. It can be different, but it's our interactions with our representatives this summer and fall that's going to determine this effort's fate, the fate of the Justice in Policing Act. But anyway, one of our old testimony buddies, Vanita Gupta, who we first met and fell in love with during the H.R. 1 debacle, was back in Congress testifying about the Justice in Policing Act. Vanita Gupta served as the head of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, which made her the most powerful civil rights prosecutor in the country during the last few years of the Obama administration. Now that Trump's in charge, she is now the CEO and president of the Leadership Conference on Human and Civil Rights. And here's the main part of her opening statement to Congress this past Wednesday.
My tenure as head of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division began 2 months after 18-year-old Michael Brown was killed by a police officer in Ferguson. The Justice Department was hardly perfect, but we understood our mandate to promote accountability and constitutional policing in order to build community trust. During the Obama administration, we opened 25 pattern or practice investigations to help realize greater structural and community-centered change, often at the request of police chiefs and mayors who needed federal leadership. After making findings, we negotiated consent decrees with extensive engagement and input from community advocates who not only identified unjust and unlawful policing practices, but also helped develop sustainable mechanisms for accountability and systemic change. That is not the Justice Department that we have today. Under both Attorneys General Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr, the department has abdicated its responsibility and abandoned the use of tools like pattern and practice investigations and consent decrees. Instead, it is focused on dismantling police accountability efforts and halting any new investigations. The disruption of crucial work in the Civil Rights Division and throughout the Department of Justice to bring forth accountability and transparency in policing is deeply concerning. In the absence of federal leadership, the Leadership Conference Education Fund launched the New Era of Public Safety Initiative, a comprehensive guide and toolkit outlining proposals to build trust between communities and police departments, restore confidence, and imagine a new paradigm of public safety. While much of these changes must happen at the state and local level, success is going to require the leadership, support, and commitment of the federal government, including Congress. Last week, the Leadership Conference and more than 400 civil rights organizations sent a letter to Congress to move us forward on a path of true accountability. The recommendations included the following. 1, create a national necessary standard on the use of force. 2, prohibit racial profiling, including robust data collection. 3, ban the use of chokeholds and other restraint maneuvers. 4, end the militarization of policing. 5, prohibit the use of no-knock warrants, especially in drug cases. 6, strengthen federal accountability systems and increase the Justice Department's authority to prosecute officers that engage in misconduct. 7, create a national police misconduct registry. And 8, end qualified immunity. The Leadership Conference was pleased to learn that the Justice and Policing Act, introduced Monday by both members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, reflects much of this accountability framework. This is Congress's most comprehensive effort in decades to substantially address police misconduct by taking on critical issues affecting Black and brown communities.
And I read the whole bill. I see what she sees. Now, this bill could definitely be stronger in some ways, and as we go, I will point those ways out. But overall, this is a good bill that would make our society better. And so let's start with some provisions from that bill that I think are long overdue. And settle in, because you're in for a rabbit hole here. Because you may have noticed that the cops showed up to our protests all over the country in cities large and small, dressed up like they were ready for war. And when I was watching TV as a kid, Sheriff Andy Taylor and Barney Fife, and yes, I know they're fictional, but American cops, they didn't always walk about their towns with helmets and tasers and beat the shit out of us with batons, and they sure as hell didn't drive tanks. 2 generations ago, the scenes we've witnessed all over the United States in the last 2 weeks would have been unimaginable. And so how did cops transform from being society's referees to local warriors? Well, it turns out that we've been slow boiling ourselves into a militarized police state ever since I was a child, even though I think most of us didn't really wake up to it until the 2014-2015 Black Lives Matter protests after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. In the summer of 2014, Michael Brown was an 18-year-old kid, and he was killed by a cop after he may have stolen a handful of cigarettes from a shop, and he was walking away from that store with his friend. A cop pulled up to them, and the truth is I don't know what happened. There's no video. But Michael Brown was definitely unarmed, and now he's dead, and the country erupted in protests. In Ferguson, Missouri, in response to the protests, the cops rolled up looking like they were ready for war, while the world was watching. They had full military-style tactical gear, and they were driving vehicles that look a lot to us civilians, a whole lot like tanks. And the country was shocked. And so Congress held a few hearings a month later to find out how exactly our local cops became G.I. Joe. On September 9th, 2014, a professor who has studied policing for decades at the School of Justice at the University of Eastern Kentucky named Peter Kraska testified to the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. And here's some of his testimony. In this clip you're about to hear, he's going to reference the Posse Comitatus Act, which is the law that prohibits the military, except for the Coast Guard and the National Guard, from being used for domestic law enforcement. And this is punishable by a fine and 2 years in prison. Here is Professor Kraska.
the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 had been in place untouched for quite a long time until the 1980s drug war. And it wasn't until the 1980s drug war, it was actually the Reagan administration that wanted to completely repeal Posse Comitatus, but what instead happened is they just amended it significantly to allow for cross-training and weapons transference. And just as an aside, I don't want to make too much of an aside, but we also have to remember that the Department of Defense has been very actively involved in training local police departments as well, not just providing them equipment, but providing them training. I've got a great quote that I'm not going to read it now, but if you ask me to read it, I will, that talks about even having Navy SEALs and Army Rangers come to a local police department and teach them things. So it's not just weapons transference. The federal government has increasingly, since 9/11, played a significant role in accelerating these trends towards militarization.
And he continued.
I've mentioned that police militarization predates 9/11. This is not just an interesting historical fact. It is critical because it illuminates the most important reason or causal factor in this unfortunate turn in American policing and American democracy. It is the following: our long-running and intensely punitive, self-proclaimed war on crime and drugs. It is no coincidence that the skyrocketing number of police paramilitary deployments on American citizens since the early 1980s coincides perfectly with the skyrocketing imprisonment numbers. We now have 2.4 million people incarcerated in this country, and almost 4% of the American public is now under direct correctional supervision. These wars have been devastating to minority communities and the marginalized, and have resulted in a self-perpetuating growth complex. Cutting off the supply of military weaponry to our civilian police is the least we could do to begin the process of reining in police militarization and attempting to make clear the increasingly blurred distinction between the military and police. Please do not underestimate the gravity of this development. This is highly disturbing to most Americans on the left and the right.
Which I know is true. And it was also deeply disturbing watching this 5.5-year-old hearing on police brutality and hearing the exact cause of Breonna Taylor's future 2020 death be explained in detail to Congress.
The clear distinction between our civilian police and military is blurring in significant and consequential ways. The research I've been conducting since 1989 has documented quantitatively and qualitatively the steady and certain march of U.S. civilian policing down the militarization continuum, culturally, materially, operationally, and organizationally, despite massive efforts at democratizing police under the guise of community policing reforms. The growth in militarized policing has been steep and deep. In the mid-1980s, a mere 30% of police agencies had a SWAT team. Today, well over 80% of departments, large and small, have one. In the early 1980s, these agencies conducted approximately 3,000 deployments a year nationwide. Today, I estimate a very conservative figure of 60,000 per year. And it is critical to recognize that these 60,000 deployments are mostly for conducting drug searches on people's private residences. This is not to imply that all police, nearly 20,000 unique departments across our great land, are heading in this direction. But the research evidence, along with militarized tragedies in Modesto, Georgia, Ferguson, and tens of thousands of other locations, demonstrates a troubling and highly consequential overall trend. What we saw played out in the Ferguson protests was the application of a very common mindset, style of uniform, and appearance and weaponry used every day in the homes of private residences during SWAT raids. Some departments conduct as many as 500 SWAT team raids a year. And just as in the two examples above and in the Ferguson situation, it is the poor and communities of color that are most impacted.
The stormtroopers that killed Breonna were police in plain clothes who raided her home, guns drawn, like she was Osama bin Laden. Like she and her boyfriend were the enemy.
Military gear and garb changes and reinforces a war-fighting mentality among civilian police, where marginalized populations become the enemy and the police perceive of themselves as a thin blue line between order and chaos that can only be controlled through military model power.
And in the weeks that followed Breonna's death, millions of American citizens in cities across this country were treated like the enemy too, by cops dressed like soldiers.
Most police departments that handle civil protests correctly know that the last thing you want to do is instigate. It was just a wonderful article written in the Washington Post that interviewed a whole bunch of chiefs of police that understand this and how you sit back and you don't antagonize and you certainly don't display this level of weaponry.
And so the militarization of the police isn't an efficiency or it gets us better results type of thing. And so how did the cops all over the country end up equipped like the military if it wasn't to make them better at their jobs? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. Police departments have been getting free equipment from the military because the military bought too much stuff with the obscene amounts of our tax money that Congresses have spent on war during my entire lifetime. Specifically, this has been allowed through a program created by Congress in 1990 when I was just 8 years old that allows the military to give the cops free shit. It's called the 1033 program. Now, I want to make it clear that the vast majority of the stuff given away by the military is not dangerous. Most of it is boring. It's furniture and medical kits and printers and power generators. Bunch of nothing burgers. So we don't need, and actually I don't really want us to repeal the whole 1033 program. That would be overkill because we did pay for all of that equipment and it helps no one to just have it be thrown away. But there is a category of military equipment called controlled equipment. That's the dangerous stuff. And that's our problem with the 1033 program. Here's Alan Estevez. He was the Principal Deputy Defense Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology and Logistics at the Department of Defense during the hearing in 2014. So what this means is that he was a military guy in charge of where the equipment goes during the Obama years.
Examples of controlled property include over 92,000 small arms, 44,000 night vision devices, 5,200 high mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles or Humvees, and 617 mine-resistant ambush protected vehicles or MRAPs. The department does not provide tanks, grenade launchers, sniper rifles, crew-served weapons, or uniforms.
Okay, so some of that, who cares? Like night vision goggles, who cares? In fact, I want some. They sound cool. But MRAPs? MRAPs are mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles, and MRAPs are the things that my basic ass thinks are tanks when I see them on the streets. Because they look just like tanks, and I wasn't a little boy, and I don't know the difference. All I know is that my Honda doesn't stand a chance in a one-to-one standoff of one of these things, and I wouldn't know how to know if it's armed or not. And I've seen these on my streets here and on streets all over the country in the last few weeks. And you know the tank-looking trucks that I'm talking about. They paint them black and scare the shit out of us with them. Those are MRAPs, and the military gives those to the cops for free. In 2014, they were used on the streets of Ferguson, and senators had questions. This is ex-Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma talking to the military equipment guy, Alan Estevez.
How do we ever get to the point where we think states need MRAPs? How'd that process come about?
This is one of the areas that we're obviously going to look at, Senator, on how we decided what equipment is available. I mean, obviously we've made some big decisions, fighter aircraft, tanks, strikers, those type of things are not available. Sniper rifles, not available. Grenade launchers, not available.
Drones are available.
No.
Airplanes are available.
Airplanes are available.
Helicopters
Cargo helicopters. Helicopters, not Apaches.
Okay, but really, you can't tell us today how we make those decisions of what goes on the list and off.
It's basically a common sense decision inside the department, and then we do, as I keep saying, go back to the states.
Well, that's a well thought through decision making process there. Common sense. Let the states decide. The end. What? And here's where that common sense in the states plan led us. Here's Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's a senator questioning the military equipment guy, Alan Estevez.
Mr. Estevez, in the NPR investigation of the 1033 program, they list that 12,000 bayonets have been given out. What purpose are bayonets being given out for?
Senator, bayonets are available under the program. I can't answer what a local police force would need a bayonet.
I can give you an answer, none.
Okay.
So what's President Obama's administration's position on handing out bayonets to the police force? It's on your list. You guys create the list. You're going to take it off the list. We're going to keep doing it.
We are going to look at what we are providing under the administration's review of all these programs.
So it's unclear at this point whether President Obama approves of 12,000 bayonets being given out. I would think you can make that decision last week.
I think we need to review all the equipment that we're providing, Senator. And as I said, we, the Department of Defense, do not push any of this equipment on any police force. The states decide what they need.
So the War Department is just letting our local police be equipped as if they were going on patrol 200 years ago in powdered wigs. It's like we all touched the stones and went full Outlander, and now our cops have bayonets? What? I honestly didn't think bayonets were a thing anymore outside of museums. And so it makes you wonder, why is the military giving police bayonets and other weapons of war without doing any oversight or even really thinking about it? Well, here's why. Here's why the military is giving this stuff away. Here's Alan Estevez.
So as force structure changes, as our budget changes, things that we thought we would need are no longer needed, or things that we bought for the war. And I'm not talking about tactical rifles and the like. I'm talking about, basic medical kits, that type of stuff, may no longer be needed as we draw down force structure based on changing environment on the ground. BCA changes our force structure. Things that we required will no longer be needed as that force structure changes. That's a basic reason.
So basically, they used too much of our money and they bought too much war shit. And so now they got to do something with it. And so it's going to the police. And so how are the decisions made about what law enforcement can have?
Again, it's not for the department to really judge how law enforcement, that's not our expertise. We rely on the state coordinators appointed by the governor of each of those states who vet incoming requests from their local law enforcement agencies.
Oh, and those local law enforcement agencies, they are making requests. And again, this is from 5.5 years ago, and so these numbers are almost certainly higher now.
More than 8,000 federal and state law enforcement agencies actively participate in the program across 49 states and 3 U.S. territories. More than $5.1 billion of property has been provided since 1990.
So that's the military's motive. Got too much, got to give it to someone. But what about the police? Why would police take the equipment? Well, here's their favorite reason for taking stuff like MRAPs. This gets brought up every time by the defenders of this program. Here's Alan Estevez again.
During the height of Superstorm Sandy, New Jersey police drove 2 cargo trucks and 3 Humvees through water too deep for commercial vehicles to save 64 people. In Wisconsin, Green Bay police used donated computers for forensic investigations. During a 2013 flood in Louisiana, Livingston Parish police used 6 Humvees to rescue 137 people. In Texas, armored vehicles received through the program protected police officers during a standoff and shootout with gang members.
So that doesn't really do it for me. Now, obviously, the computers, who gives a shit? But when it comes to the MRAPs and the Humvees, they could rescue people from floods if they had boats. They could get inflatable boats and rescue people. Sean Penn fucking figured that out. I'm pretty sure the police can figure that out. But there is one point that they made here that does make sense to me, and that's the shootout thing. Here's Mark Lomax. In 2014, he was the National Tactical Officers Association Executive Director. And here's some of his testimony to the Senate back in 2014.
The threat that firearms pose to law enforcement officers and the public during violent critical incidents has proven that armored rescue vehicles have become as essential as individually worn body armor or helmets in saving lives.
And there's something to that, America. If we're going to continue to let any old dumbass have a gun, that makes the job of police, of being society's referee, a lot more dangerous. If we want the police to put down some of their arms, we're going to have to put some limits on the firepower of dumb civilian Americans. You know, we've all been sitting at home for months at this point during COVID, and I think everyone and their mom has watched The Tiger King. And so if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, fast forward 30 seconds. But you know what was the most disturbing part of Tiger King for me? It wasn't Carol feeding her husband to a tiger. No, it was the Tiger King's methed up husband casually pointing his loaded gun at his friends. He did it all the time, apparently, before he ended up accidentally blowing his own brains out. Cops have to deal with that guy every day, and there's a lot of that guy in America. I've been all over this country, and I haven't met a single gun owner that admits that he's the irresponsible gun owner. Every gun owner thinks they're the responsible ones. Every gun owner thinks they're the good guys. The crazy ones never know they're crazy, and they're all allowed to have guns that shoot many bullets very quickly. And now that we know that bayonets are still a thing, that's what a gun was when the Constitution was written. So you know what? Let them all have bayonets. I'm fine with that because they take a minute to reload, one bullet at a time. But with the way things are now, I would never want to make resolving conflicts with armed bumpkins and the other American tough guys. I would never want that to be my job. Police are right to be scared every time they put on their uniform. And so if we want the police to pack less heat, we have to pack less too, because both sides are militarized here. But again, it's the police that have the most power, and they are abusing the public trust. And so I'm going to shift my focus back to them, but this is something to think about. And there's not a single word in the Justice and Policing Act that limits a civilian's right to buy weapons. And so if anyone tells you that there is, they're full of shit. The focus of this bill is limiting the militarization of the police. And the truth is that this issue, like damn near all issues, comes down to pure stupid money. Here's Senator Ron Johnson of Ohio speaking to Alan Estevez, the military equipment guy.
This program, which has apparently provided about $5.1 billion of free equipment since 1997, it's all been free, correct?
Yes, it's not free to the taxpayer. We bought it, used it.
Free to local governments, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Free to local police departments.
Yes, sir, Senator.
Do you know of too many police departments that turn free things down?
Again, not in the position of a local police department, but if something was available and they thought they needed it, because they have to sustain this equipment, if they thought they needed it and it was useful to them, why not?
A ticket, cuz why not? And you know what? You want to give me a not a tank for free? I'll take it. I'll get myself a storage unit. I don't know what exactly I'll do with it, other than I guess I would drive it in parades. And if we're being honest, I'd probably invite my favorite friends to smoke joints in my tank. But the point is, yes, free mini tank. Who would say no to that? Well, apparently not many people in law enforcement, because lots of this equipment has gone local.
Law enforcement agencies currently possess approximately 460,000 pieces of controlled property that they have received over time.
But it doesn't have to stay that way. There is an out. Here's ex-Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma and the military equipment dude.
When something is removed from the list, and I don't know if you have any recent experience with this, are agencies required to return the restricted equipment?
That's why we retain title for what we call controlled equipment, so that we can pull that equipment.
But that's a Defense Department policy. That's not law right now. And so the Justice and Policing Act would make it law that the local police can never be the owners of the controlled equipment. It would be on loan from the military only forever. And if a police department got investigated by the Justice Department and was found to have, quote, engaged in widespread civil rights abuses, unquote, then that police department would have to give the controlled, the dangerous equipment back. That being law will help. Those are real consequences for an entire department that doesn't keep its members in check. But even better, the Justice and Policing Act would prohibit the transfer of controlled firearms, ammunition, bayonets, grenade launchers, grenades, including those fucking flashbang things, explosives, controlled vehicles, MRAPs, trucks, drones, combat aircraft, silencers, and long-range acoustic devices, which are those sound blasters, which is essential. That is my favorite thing one of my favorite things in this bill. There's actually quite a few. But there is a problem with it, which is that this would apply only to equipment transferred in the future. And so if the police already have these items, the Democrats aren't interested in forcing the police to give them back unless the Justice Department busts them for civil rights abuses. And so the best we can get in this Congress is a slowing of the militarization of the police. This wouldn't end it, but it's a start. On top of that, the Justice and Policing Act would give local communities, finally, a role in making these equipment decisions. The Justice and Policing Act would require police departments to tell the Defense Department how they intend to use the military equipment. They'd have to say, this is why we need a fucking bayonet. The police would then have to post a notice for at least 30 days on their website and at, quote, several prominent locations in their jurisdiction, unquote, telling us that they're requesting this military equipment. And then the city council would have to approve the police department's request for military equipment. All that is good because local elected officials should have a vote in this process. And then to get our federal representatives involved, reports on where the equipment goes would have to be submitted to Congress. That's a drastic improvement, even if you want the military equipment returned immediately, which I personally do. But I am not going to make a good bill go bye-bye because it's not perfect. This is worth supporting as a stepping stone. But I do want to mention that while these changes are helpful, the military isn't the only source of the military equipment that the cops currently have. They're also getting money from the Department of Homeland Security to buy equipment. The following clip is Brian Kamoe. He was the FEMA Grant Programs Assistant Administrator in 2014 during the Obama years. And so the exact procedures he talks about here may have changed during the Trump years, but you'll get an idea of what's going on.
Grant recipients must purchase equipment listed on the department's authorized equipment list, which outlines 21 categories of allowable equipment. The department prohibits the use of grant funds for the purchase of lethal or non-lethal weapons and ammunition. These equipment categories are not on the authorized equipment list. Homeland Security grant funds may be used to purchase equipment that can be classified as personal protective equipment, such as ballistics protection equipment, helmets, body armor, and ear and eye protection. Response vehicles, such as Bearcats, are also allowed. The Homeland Security Act allows equipment purchased with grant funds, including personal protective equipment, to be used for purposes unrelated to terrorism, so long as one purpose of the equipment is to build and sustain terrorism-based capabilities.
So terrorism is the magic word if you want Department of Homeland Security money to buy military equipment with, which set off my spidey sense because the Justice and Policing Act would prohibit the 1033 program, that military program we've been talking about, from transferring military equipment to police for counter-drug and border security activities, which is good, but they would still be able to get equipment for counterterrorism. So the Democrats want to make the military program match the DHS grant program. And ending military equipment for drug raids is necessary and good, but all's still fair in the war on terrorism. But while the programs would be aligned on what purpose the equipment can be used for, terrorism, the DHS has one rule that the Department of Defense's 1033 program doesn't seem to have. Here's Brian Kamoe.
The authorized equipment list also notes that ballistic personal protective equipment purchased with grant funds is not for riot suppression.
Which means that if it can be proved that equipment used against us in these last few weeks was bought with Department of Homeland Security funds by the cops, that's a way to legally go after the police department and get their military toys taken away. But whether the cops are gifted the military stuff from the military or if they buy it with money from the department George W. Bush invented, the Department of Homeland Security, the result's the same. G.I. Joe is policing our neighborhoods. And so are the two departments at least aware of what the other is doing? Are there any safeguards to make sure that the cops aren't doubling up on all this equipment? Here's ex-Senator Kelly Ayotte. Doesn't matter. She's not a senator anymore. But she was from New Hampshire, and she is talking to Brian Kamoe of FEMA.
Is there any coordination between the grants that Homeland is giving in light of what the departments are receiving on the 1033 front?
We don't coordinate in the decision-making about local law enforcement requests. The process that Mr. Estevez has laid out, we don't coordinate that at all.
Which seems to explain how we ended up in situations like this. This is ex-Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri talking to the military equipment dude, Alan Estevez.
In the Lake Angeles Police Department in Michigan, you gave them 13 military assault weapons since 2011. They have one full-time sworn officer. So one officer now has 13 military-grade assault weapons in their police department. How in the world can anyone say that this program has one lick of oversight if those two things are in existence?
I'll have to look into the details on each of those. The rule of thumb is one MRAP validated by the state coordinator for a police department that requests an MRAP, no more than one. So I'd have to look at the incident in Senator Coburn's state. And same thing with rifles, weapons. I will make part of the record the list. We have a long list of law enforcement agencies that received 3 times as many, 5.56 and 7.62 military-grade weapons per full-time officer. And this is a long list.
That's a problem. And it's one that I do have to say the Obama administration was interested in solving. They put some limits via executive order on this program, but then Trump came into office and made that executive order go away. And so this is the problem of counting on executive orders to do anything. They can be overturned by the next administration. So this stuff needs to become law. And you know what's cool is that the Republicans are not against this idea. So the following clip is Representative Tom McClintock. This is from this week. I have been very open in the fact that I am not a Tom McClintock fan. He is corrupt. He has been bought off by agribusiness and by the lumber industry. He is one of the Republicans that goes into the smart, sneaky, ruthless category. But when he says this, it does give me some hope that maybe Republicans and Democrats could actually get together and do something about this particular problem. Here's Tom McClintock on Wednesday.
Turning police departments into paramilitary organizations is antithetical to the 6th principle laid down by Peel, quote, to use only the minimum degree of physical force which is necessary on any particular occasion for achieving a police objective. Weapons that are unique to a battlefield need to be limited to a battlefield.
So there's some hope for you. And so the Justice and Policing Act is a start for the militarization issue. I'd prefer it were law than not, and it's possible. But even if it does become law, we do need that counterterrorism loophole closed. Because the war on terrorism is just as deadly and stupid as the war on drugs. They're both wars that can't be won. The war on terrorism, that's a war on a tactic. It's a war on a strategy. It's impossible to win that, especially because what is and what is not terrorism, there's no clear line. Terrorists, terrorism, those are labels, not facts. And so they're busting in doors now for counter drugs. And if they want to keep doing this, they would just have to label us as terrorists. And this is concerning because Trump just named Antifa, which stands for anti-fascists. It's not even an organization. He named Antifa a terrorist organization. Or at least he said he was going to. There might be someone in his administration with a fucking brain that'll go like, oh, by the way, that's not an actual organization. So I don't know if that's actually happened. But where this heads is obvious. Trump wants to be able to label you an anti-fascist, which means you are also labeled a terrorist, which then legally, in these lawless war on terror times, lets him drone kill you. And this is reality. This is actually allowed because President Obama, I know so many people miss him so much, but President Obama got away with drone killing American citizens overseas. These were targeted killings. This was no accident. And there were no consequences for President Obama because they were labeled terrorists. There were no trials, just a death sentence by flying robot ordered by the President of the United States. Like I said, killing with impunity is happening from the top down in law enforcement in the United States, and this has been going on for a long time. It's just getting worse, that's all. And so it's not okay that Democrats are leaving this counterterrorism loophole open for the law enforcement branch. The resistance is weak with this one. But it's better than what we have in law right now, for sure. Because if this bill had been a law this year, Breonna Taylor might still be alive. Because she was a victim of a no-knock raid on her home. She woke up and there were stormtroopers in her home. They didn't knock. She didn't know they were coming. They were just there in the room. And the procedures for cops that do this, here's Professor Kraska.
50% of these small police departments, 50% of them are receiving less than 50 hours of training per year for their SWAT team. The recommended amount from the NTOA used to be 250. I think they've reduced it to 200. 250 hours versus 50 hours. These are not well-trained teams. These are a localized 18,000 police departments all doing their own thing with no oversight and no accountability. And that's why we're seeing, and we have seen, hundreds of these kinds of tragedies that I've mentioned, but also lots of terrorized families that have been caught up in these drug operations and drug raids. Thank you.
And the Justice in Policing Act would say enough with this shit. What the bill would do, if it could become law, is it would say that search warrants authorized for drug cases would have to require that the law enforcement officers provide notice of his or her authority and purpose for being there. As in, they'd have to fucking knock and tell you why they're there. And again, there's some hope here because Republicans might be on board. Here's Tom McClintock from this past Wednesday.
No-knock warrants have been proven to be lethal to citizens and to police officials for obvious reasons. The invasion of a person's home is one of the most terrifying powers the government possesses. Every person in a free society has the right to take arms against an intruder in their homes. And that means that the authority of the police must be announced before that intrusion takes place. To do otherwise places every one of us in moral peril.
And so that provision could have saved Breonna Taylor. But what about George Floyd and Eric Gardner and the others whose deaths by suffocation at the hands of cops weren't caught on video? Well, the Justice in Policing Act could have helped. For Eric Gardner, who was choked to death by a NYPD officer for selling loose cigarettes, well, this bill would classify chokeholds as a civil rights violation. What that means is that the video that we all saw of Eric Gardner being choked to death would have triggered a Justice Department investigation, which the NYPD easily could have been prosecuted for. And if the department would have been found guilty, because they would have had to give back all their free military equipment. There would have been consequences for the entire department for that chokehold. And no cop would want to be that guy that forces the entire NYPD to give back their mini tanks. And for George Floyd, the Justice in Policing Act would have required training for officers that tells them that they have a clear duty to intervene if another officer is using excessive force, such as if that officer was sitting on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It would have also made it law that deadly force could only be used as a last resort and only to, quote, prevent imminent and serious bodily injury or death to the officer or another person, unquote. George Floyd wasn't physically threatening anybody, and the videos proved it. And so in that regard, the Justice in Policing Act could have helped him too. Here's the lawyer for George Floyd's family, Ben Crump, testifying to the House this past Wednesday.
The only reason we know what happened to George Floyd is because it was captured on video. The advent of video evidence is bringing into the light what long was hidden. It's revealing what Black Americans have known for a long, long time, that it is dangerous for a Black person to have an encounter with a police officer. Given the incidents that have led to this moment in time, it should be mandatory for police officers to wear body cams and should be considered obstruction of justice to turn them off. Like a black box data recorder in an airplane, body cams replace competing narratives with a single narrative, the truth, with what we see with our own eyes.
And the Justice in Policing Act goes almost there. It would require uniformed officers nationwide to wear a body camera, and the camera, video and audio, must be activated whenever that officer is responding to a call for service or during any other law enforcement encounter with a member of the public. That's great. I want it. Now, the bill would allow some times when they would be permitted to turn the cameras off. So like if the cop was in a victim's home and the victim didn't want the camera on, or if the officer was in a school, which I think is a weird one. And I would love to have a hearing to debate, like, why would they be able to turn them off in schools? But also they'd be able to turn off the cameras if the cop is speaking to an informant who wants to remain anonymous. And the punishment for turning the camera off inappropriately is definitely not strong enough. It's not obstruction of justice. The bill says that, quote, appropriate disciplinary action shall be taken, unquote, if the camera is turned off. And that's way too vague. But the interference, the act of turning off the camera, would be allowed to be used as evidence in court. And so again, this needs to be strengthened, but at least it's better than what we have now. And following up on the last episode about facial recognition software being used by law enforcement, the Justice and Policing Act would not allow the body cameras to be equipped with real-time facial recognition technology, and that technology could only be used with the footage with a warrant. Right now, facial recognition technology is damn near lawless on the federal level, and so this is really important to get into law. On top of the body cameras, the Justice and Policing Act would require video cameras in the police cars to record whenever an officer is on patrol duty, conducting an enforcement stop, when patrol lights are activated, when the officer thinks the recording could help with the prosecution, and when an arrestee is being transported. And the patrol car cameras could also not be equipped with facial recognition technology. I want this to be federal law. But all of this, while mostly good, right? It's a pretty good bill. Well, this is worthwhile. The most important thing that needs to happen to limit police violence against civilians is that the impunity needs to stop. Because in the past, when we saw cops gone wild, it was assumed to be just an isolated incident. Like when Rodney King got the shit kicked out of him by a gang of cops in 1991, here's the common wisdom in Congress about what happened there. Here's ex-Representative Howard Coble of North Carolina speaking in a House hearing in 1991.
It would be my hope that this matter could be resolved internally in Los Angeles. The fear I have about what occurred on the coast is that many people are probably going to try to bash every law enforcement officer in the country. That's what bothers me. And I don't think this is an accurate portrayal of law enforcement in this country.
And when civil rights violations occurred, they were most often literally dismissed. Here's ex-Representative Henry Hyde of Illinois speaking to John Dunn, who at the time was the Assistant Attorney General of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division. Here's a conversation that they had in that same 1991 hearing.
I note civil rights prosecutions nationwide by year, compiled from annual Department of Justice statistics, and in 1990, there were 7,960 complaints received and 3,050 investigations. I take it a great number of the complaints were found to be without merit or beyond investigation, but cases presented to the grand jury or grand juries were only 46. So out of 3,050 investigations, there are only 46 that you felt worth taking to a grand jury. Was that right, Mr. Dunn?
Mr. Hyde, in light of all of the circumstances, specifically, the key being whether or not the federal state interest had been vindicated, yes, be about 1.5%, usually runs about 2% a year of the complaints we receive actually go to prosecution.
So those odds didn't strike fear into the hearts of violent cops. Fast forward almost 30 years, and we all saw a cop casually with his hand in his pocket, looking right into a camera that was filming him kill George Floyd, like he didn't have a care in the world. There was no fear of consequences. There was impunity. We saw cops in city after city beating, gassing, and shooting at civilians. No fear of consequences. We saw impunity. And so how did we get here? Well, Sherilyn Ifill, she is the president and director counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. She knows, and this is what she told Congress this week.
One of the key parts of the system of impunity has been qualified immunity, a defense that shields officials from the unforeseeable consequences of their act, but has been interpreted by courts so expansively that it now provides near immunity for police officers who engage in unconstitutional acts of violence.
Qualified immunity is a part of federal law that protects government officials from being held personally liable, so they can't be personally sued or prosecuted for actions performed as part of their jobs, unless their actions violate, quote, clearly established, unquote, federal law. Well, the law hasn't clearly established the lines for cops enough. That much is clear. We know that based on what we've seen on American streets in the last few months. And few years, 30 fucking years. And Sherilyn Ifill knows it based on what she's seen in court and in our laws.
Principal problems that we have found in this longstanding systemic issue of police violence against unarmed African Americans is the inability to hold officers who engage in this conduct accountable. Now, this is not just about the individual officer who some refer to as a bad apple. This is about a system of accountability that must exist if police officers are to understand that they cannot engage in certain kinds of conduct without impunity. And unfortunately, all of the legal tools that are available to us to hold officers accountable have been weakened or lack the sufficient strength and language to allow us to do so. So strengthening the language of the federal criminal statute that will not hold us to such a high standard in proving intent of the officer's conduct is critical. And so adding a recklessness provision into that language that will allow us to get at some of this officer conduct is vitally important.
And so
the Justice in Policing Act seeks to address qualified immunity by amending the civil rights statute used most in police excessive use of force cases, 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. And we welcome this amendment. We want it to apply to all civil suits that are pending or filed after enactment of the Act. And we'll continue to work towards the elimination of qualified immunity.
So the Democrats in the 116th Congress are not willing to end qualified immunity, but they're willing to limit it. Specifically, the Justice in Policing Act would make it a crime for a law enforcement officer to, quote, knowingly or with reckless disregard, unquote, deprive a person of a right or privilege protected by the Constitution. And this is different. Right now in law, they have to, quote, willingly, unquote, deprive a person of their rights in order to be prosecuted. And so this takes away the requirement for the prosecutors to prove intent. And so in this case we're dealing with now, did that cop intend to kill George Floyd? It wouldn't fucking matter because it was reckless to sit on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That should be enough. And if the Justice in Policing Act were law, it would be. On top of that, the Justice in Policing Act would allow victims of racial profiling to sue in civil courts, either in the state or in a district court of the United States. And so the police departments, the whole departments, would be financially incentivized to make sure that racial profiling doesn't happen, or they would lose money. And again, there's hope in this 116th Congress. Here's smart Republican Tom McClintock in this week's hearing.
I think there are many proposals that have been raised in the House that merit support. And first is the doctrine of qualified immunity as it's currently applied. It has no place in a nation ruled by laws. For every right, there must be a remedy. And qualified immunity prevents a remedy for those whose rights have been violated by officials holding a public trust. And this reform should apply as much to a rogue cop who targets people because of their race as it does to IRS or Justice Department officials who target people on the basis of their politics.
And yes, longtime listener, I did find it infuriating that he said that. Because back in the Obama years, for you newbies, congressional Republicans created a whole fake scandal. They said that the IRS was targeting conservatives for their political beliefs, and it was horseshit. The IRS was targeting 501c4 so-called social welfare organizations, which were actually political organizations pretending to be social welfare so that they could keep their donors secret. The Republicans wanted to keep secret the people donating to help their campaigns through bullshit social welfare organizations, and so they held hearings and they publicly trashed IRS employees that were just doing their jobs. It was so effective that no one right now is policing 501c4s at the IRS anymore. They're terrified to touch them, which was exactly the point. And so, yes, I see the evil lurking behind McClintock's support here. But if this change to qualified immunity stops cops from killing us with impunity, we'll just deal with the Republicans trying to use this against other civil servants. Hopefully, we'll do that by voting the Republican Party out of existence in our Congress. But that said, there are signs that not all Republicans are on board the way that McClintock is. Here's Representative Greg Steube of Florida, and he is a resident of the dum-dum wing of the Republican Party, but he and McClintock not on the same page.
But there are proposals in this bill that are extremely dangerous for those who protect our communities. Removing qualified immunity is only a protection if officers follow their training and protocols. If they don't follow the training and protocols, they don't get to use the immunity because it's qualified. If officers don't have qualified immunity to follow their training and protocols, I don't know a single person who would want to become a law enforcement officer in today's world, knowing that they may or may not be able to use the training and protocols that they were used to be able to apprehend a suspect who is not complying with them. But maybe that's the goal of the majority, to get less and less people to join our law enforcement offices.
So I know that was mainly gibberish, but the point is that Republicans are not all on board and need to be pressured to limit qualified immunity. They need to be bullied into supporting this during this election year. Now is the time. We have the most influence over these people. Now is the time for the pressure. And now is also the time to demand independent prosecutors for cases involving cops. So in this following clip, Representative Hank Johnson of Georgia is speaking to a lot of witnesses. So first, he's going to talk to Mark Morial, who is the president and chief executive officer of the National Urban League. Then he's going to talk to Paul Butler, who is a professor at Georgetown's law school. Then he's going to talk to George Floyd's family lawyer, Ben Crump. And then he'll talk to Vanita Gupta, who is that lady that I love, who was the head of the civil rights prosecutions in the Justice Department during the late Obama years.
Mayor Morial, throughout recent times, we've seen repeated instances where black people, often unarmed, have been killed by a police officer, and if the death results in a use of force investigation, that investigation most often is conducted by the law enforcement agency that employs the officer who used the deadly force. Isn't that correct?
That's traditionally the way it works.
And Professor Butler, we've also witnessed these use of force investigations being overseen by the local district attorney who works hand in hand, day after day, year after year, with the same officer and with the agency that employs the officer who used the deadly force in the case that's under investigation. Isn't that correct? Yes. And Attorney Crump, we've seen time and time again that the investigation becomes long and drawn out. And at some point, months or even years later, the local prosecutor takes that case before a secret grand jury. And out of that grand jury usually comes what's called a no bill, which is a refusal to indict the officer who committed the homicide. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir, Congressman Johnson.
And Professor Butler, because grand jury proceedings are secret, the public never learns exactly what the prosecutor presented to the grand jury. Isn't that correct?
Just like the grand jury proceeding in Staten Island with Eric Garner, who was placed in an illegal chokehold, we have no idea why that grand jury didn't indict that officer for murder.
It becomes just another justified killing of a black person by the police in America. Wouldn't it be fairer if the homicide investigation were undertaken by an independent police agency, Attorney Gupta?
I think it would. It would also give the community members much more faith in their legal system if there was an independent investigator in these kinds of cases.
And the Justice and Policing Act goes in that direction. So what it does is it gives the Attorney General the authority to give grants to states to help them conduct independent investigations of law enforcement, which I don't exactly love because right now the Attorney General is William Barr, who, when President Donald Trump decided to gas and have bullets sprayed, or rubber bullets, but basically clear peaceful protesters so that he could take the weirdest photo op of all time, holding an upside down Bible that I'm pretty sure he's never read in front of a church. That was one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. And as he was illegally using force against peaceful protesters in a park where I personally have been arrested for protesting, when he did that, Attorney General Barr was standing there watching. He was outside watching the whole thing go down. So this is not someone that I trust, but if we do have a better attorney general who gives a flying we could use this provision to have independent investigations happen. But I wish this provision were stronger. I would like independent prosecutors for all law enforcement uses of force cases. But again, this is better than the nothing we have now. And then last, when it comes to bad cops, in the rare instances that a cop does get in trouble and gets fired, they often just move. They don't even have to go all that far, but they just move and just get rehired. And so to help prevent that, the Justice and Policing Act would create a national database with information about law enforcement officers and the actions of the departments where they work. So for the officers, the Attorney General would have to list each complaint filed against the law enforcement officer, their termination records, their certifications, and records of lawsuits and settlements made against that officer. And then for the police departments, they would have to report their numbers of traffic stops, pedestrian stops, uses of deadly force, and they'd have to report all of this by race, ethnicity, age, and gender of the officers and the members of the public who were involved. And all of this information would be available to the public. And so out of all the provisions that I've told you about today, this database stands the best chance of becoming law this year. Here's Vanita Gupta.
I will tell you there's actually significant law enforcement support for this kind of registry, and prosecutors around the country have asked for this kind of registry, but chiefs in particular have said that this is a real problem when they don't have this kind of information when they're making hiring decisions.
And here's Republican Tom McClintock saying a version of what just about every Republican who spoke about it said.
Police records must be open to the public. It is a well-established principle that public servants work for the public, and the public has a right to know what they're doing with the authority the public has loaned them. And police departments should be able to dismiss bad officers without interference from the unions.
And that union thing was a Republican theme throughout the hearing. The Republicans intend to use this opportunity to try to bust the police unions, just like they've busted every other worker union in this country. So heads up on that. But basically, the Justice in Policing Act stands a snowball's chance in hell of becoming law in this Congress in this form. But I promise I have not just wasted your time. But the reason that I say this is that most of the bill, when broken down piece by piece, as you heard, has bipartisan support. But it's an election year, and 8 years of watching Congress as closely as I have has taught me that Mitch McConnell, the Republican in the Senate who controls the Senate at this point, will not allow the House Democrats to have this big of a win. And so the Justice in Policing Act is most likely going to pass the House and then die in the Senate. And even if it didn't, President Law and Order wouldn't sign this into law. President Trump needs to be tricked into it. Which brings me to the Dingleberry Method. During the Obama years, the Republicans got all kinds of terrible shit into law using the Dingleberry Method, which is when they attach what they want to must-sign legislation, usually government funding laws. So when they wanted to legalize bank bailouts of banks foreign and domestic, they Dingleberried that onto a government funding law. If Obama didn't sign it, the consequence would have been a government shutdown. And he signed it. When the Republicans wanted a treaty to be approved that allowed oil drilling even deeper in the Gulf of Mexico than where the Deepwater Horizon was drilled, well, they Dingleberried that into law on a government funding law. If Obama didn't sign it, that would have triggered a government shutdown. And so he signed it. This is why we've had so many government shutdown crises since 2012. It's a tactic the Republicans used over and over again to ruthlessly get their priorities into law using President Obama's pen. And this can be used against Trump, too. So for the 1033 program, the one that transfers military equipment to the cops, there's a few opportunities to Dingleberry those provisions into law. The most obvious opportunity is the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which gives permission for all of our war activities. The NDAA becomes law every single year without fail. The Democrats could and should attach the demilitarization provisions from the Justice in Policing Act to the NDAA and tell Trump and the war lovers in the party that he leads that if they want their wars, they're going to have to limit 1033. And if they don't want to do it on the NDAA, they can use the defense funding law too. Then for the provisions about qualified immunity and the database and the independent prosecutor, those can and should all be attached to the Justice Department's funding law. Although in reality, all of the sections of funding are looking likely to be funded in one giant law again. They call it an omnibus. In a normal year, which, by the way, they usually don't get their funding work done on time anyway, on time being by September 30th. So even in a normal year, they usually do it late. But usually, by this time, we're now in June, they usually have the pieces, the 12 pieces of funding, mostly written by now in the House. But in this COVID year, where the House has been MIA since mid-March, they're just now getting started. But that works in our favor, because now is an opportunity to pressure them to attach the pieces of the Justice in Policing Act. Maybe they can even attach the whole thing. But they can attach it to the government funding. This play can work. We've seen it work over and over again. But it will take the House Democrats coming back to work and growing some balls. And it's going to take voters making calls to them with specific demands to encourage their ball growth. Now, my fantasy is that people look at the Justice and Policing Act and tether our demands to that. Because realistically, what is possible is what is in that bill. And I'm saying this because I'm seeing a lot of chatter on the streets, on the signs, and in social media about defund the police, which, first of all, I don't even know what people mean when they say that. Every person has had a different definition and explanation, but it doesn't matter because in this Congress, it is a non-starter. So much breath was wasted in the hearing on Wednesday by members of Congress arguing against defunding the police, whatever that means, which was silly because there's nothing in the bill that would do that. And so if you're calling Congress asking for a defunding of the police, you are wasting your time and you're wasting your breath. Let's fight for what's achievable. Limiting the 1033 program, stopping any more transfers of military equipment to police, that's achievable. Making no-knock raids on our homes illegal, that's achievable. Limiting qualified immunity by making reckless endangerment of citizens a crime, that's achievable. Creating a public database listing complaints against cops and police departments, that's achievable. If we focus on what those in power in the House are already offering in bill form, meaningful legal change is possible, and it's possible right now. And so, if you like this idea, spread the word, because this ain't that big of a podcast, and do it quick. Because hashtag Black Lives Matter is already starting to fade out of my social media feeds, just like it did in 2015. And I just hope we don't waste another opportunity to save lives. And so that's all for today. All of my sources for this episode and links to donation options are in this episode's show notes. And those show notes are in whatever app you're using and on congressionaldish.com. All producers of this episode will be thanked in the next thank you episode that I will air as soon as I move all of my belongings to Los Angeles. And because I'm moving in the next few weeks, there's going to be a delay in the next episode. I don't have a date for you yet. But if you produce this episode, the next episode shall come. And so thank you for being a part of this. Please stay safe. Please keep fighting. And I'll be around on Twitter and Instagram at Jen Briney in both locations if you want to chat. Mwah. Bye-bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.